Good evening. This evening, I want to talk about what what words really mean when we're talking about particularly sex and gender and identity, and particularly in the context of my own life. And I think the progress among several different parallel situations can shed some light. So let's just go right to it. That's me, and that's the Woodlawn. That was Woodlawn Elementary School back in um, the 1950s. I had second and sixth grade in this classroom right here. Now it is um, it is a hospice, and my mother actually died in this hospice in the same building in December 2010. So that's kind of ironic. And so let me get to the heart of this classification of a person as a man or a woman. In my experience, I'm going to talk about the whole life, not just what's going on recently. Depends mainly on immutable biological components, which are mainly reproductive structures, even if the individual person doesn't use them. And then the impression to extend to a lesser extent, the impression the person makes on others, somewhat physically with secondary sex characteristics, but more importantly, performativities and publicly apparent inclinations to prefer some kinds of actions um, over others in a way that is viewed by society as perhaps gendered. And some kinds of actions are kind of normative. In other words, for most adults, getting married and having children and forming a family and raising a family is normative behavior. Even if you do a gender with the way using Judith Butler's idea, the inclination to do a particular set of tasks or behaviors can be listed as a defining characteristic of someone. So, and of course, a boy or a girl is someone that will become a man or a woman. And so that we go on to why this matters. And I think there are kind of three or four parallel situations that can happen. College dorms until the early 1960s. And I got caught in a situation and expelled from William and Mary, and I'll get into that in a minute, in 1961 over this issue. Then later on, and 33 decades later, the gays in the military and the don't ask, don't tell policy became an issue. Um, but there have always been other occupations in which people have to be in closed spaces, some sort of forced intimacy. They could be inclined other services like the Peace Corps, or could find things like firefighting, that was actually an issue in the 1970s when New York tried to pass its first gay rights law, and people got over it. Um, in some ways, being able to take care of children is involved. Some people think um, um, take particularly young children would be involved teaching, so that's implied. And more recently, with the debate over gender identity, biological female spaces are an issue these days, all in a somewhat parallel way. And I guess if you take a more flexible attitude toward one thing and in like in 1960 or 1969 or something, a few decades later, you're going to be trying to take it in other areas. So that's the kind of why it's important to look at it this way. And my own experience in grade school, and that's Swanson Junior High School. Junior high was grades 7 through 9 in the night then. Now it's 6 through 8. It's changed. But by third grade, I was very conscious I was way behind other boys physically. I had some compensation. I was taking piano, became good at that. Eventually became a good student. I was socially isolated, perhaps have some degree of Asperger's syndrome, a little bit of autism, but I was expected to deal with it and catch up and become physically proficient. Now, what we happened in high school is you would just pass gym and they would give you a C most of the time, although I got a D in tumbling one time. But the reason for this is that men are supposed to sometimes be able to protect women and children, even when those children aren't theirs. And when you have disasters, when you have war, and the whole issue of the male-only military draft. And by the way, trans people, and today we don't draft people; we still require people to register, and trans people have to register if they were born as male. That's not something that isn't talked about very much. And also the ability to do dirtier jobs. There was a series on CNN about that. Now I sort of got a break a little bit in PE, and in early day, I didn't learn to swim very well either, and we didn't have a swimming pool in high school yet. That's kind of interesting. But I would, and so I kind of got passed through, so because of my brains, and not everybody does. And that's a little bit of a question. There's a little bit of a moral question there. Then the whole idea of my attitude towards other people, upward affiliation, and wanting to find people to look up to and be intimate with, which I'll talk about in another video, but that's a major part of it. Um, my my expulsion from William and Mary, which I've talked about in the pitch deck on the Do As Do Tell show earlier. I was called into the dean's office in the middle of Thanksgiving weekend in 1961, and I admitted that I was a latent homosexual, as if that was one word or was a separate category person. So this label, since it's a label, and I announced it, it's announced with the to be, the conjugation of the verb, and it amounts to classifying me. My father used to say I was pinning a label on myself, which is what's going on today with gender ideology. But it means that I had had homosexual arousal in the presence of attractive men before, but I'd never acted on it publicly. So that logically placed me in a subclass of what we call men. Now, some indigenous cultures would have regarded me as a separate gender because of the widespread social consequences of adults who don't bear children. And that might be something that gender ideology wants, but you can imagine how an authoritarian society in the future could abuse it. And so that's one of the reasons I'm very concerned about what's been going on recently. Um, Now, the college believed it had to protect the class of normative men. It's men who intend to marry and have children and date girls and so forth and are attracted to women. They felt that the presence of a homosexual could make, just simply the idea that somebody like me would have opinions about who is attractive and who isn't, and would have a subtle influence in making the rest of them anxious. So, and also because I was an only child, which is kind of unusual for gay men, that could have an effect on my parents. So there were reasons why this was taken the way it was then. Um, the next phase of my experience after finishing undergrad at home and getting good at chess and going to graduate school was the military draft. It's a long story. I went to grad school at the University of Kansas and got my master's in math in January of 1968. I taught undergraduates, and that was kind of a sensitive thing. Male students were sensitive about the grades they could get, even from me, because of draft deferments and the whole moral implication of a system of student deferments, and the idea that you had to prove that you kind of had to prove that you were worthy of surviving a war situation, that if you were smarter, you were worthier. And it has very unpleasant implications today because we know where that's led in the past. But that's how people thought. And remember the whole idea about McNamara's morons during the Vietnam War and the draft. Remember all that? Um, And I spent 3 months in the Pentagon, learned a lot of heavy duty stuff about the Vietnam War. We can talk about another time. It's been useful later in my life. But there were security clearance issues for me because of my history of psychiatric treatment. So I was transferred to Fort Eustis after 4 months or so in the Pentagon. And I was sort of sheltered from going to Vietnam. Um, so I was somewhat privileged, and there's kind of a moral irony in all this. Um, but then in the 1990s, of course, President Bill Clinton proposed lifting the ban, wound up with the don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue, and the argument about privacy in the barracks and making people uncomfortable, the scoping and all of that kind of thing. Um, it sort of resembled the same arguments were used against me 3 decades before. Now, while I was working for a company that sold to military officers, I developed the idea of writing a book on what had happened to me, on which I published in 1997. But we arranged for me to transfer to another part of the company and move to Minneapolis, which happened in 1997, just before publication, to avoid what we thought was a conflict of interest. Um, the repeal happened in 2010 and 2011, and I could talk about Service Members Legal Defense Network, which was very involved with it. And there are many other cases. Some of them, a couple of them became films, and there were many books by many other gay service members that you can read. I've talked about before. By the way, this did not affect transgender as that is transition adults. They have a history, separate history. Trump tried to ban them, and then Biden let them back in. So that's just something to note. And then in 2003, and it's pretty complicated, but after a layoff, after post 9/11 layoff, and putzing around with some jobs, telemarketing and so forth for the Minnesota Orchestra and so forth, and actually worked as a debt collector. I came home, lived with my mother from the fall of 2003 till she passed away at the end of 2010. And then starting about 2007, she started to deteriorate. There had been a problem when I was in Minneapolis when she had to have heart surgery. It's another story. But she started to decline in 2007, 2008. In the last 18 months, I hired caregivers. I didn't have a really good work history. I'd worked as a substitute teacher, and my lack of experience as a parent made it very difficult for me to um, be, have classroom management and give effective discipline. So that was an issue. And then there were some jobs that some sort of hucksterism jobs that people wanted me to take. Almost could have become a tax preparer at one point. But I wound up not doing these. I wound up just wanting to continue on my writing and blogging, even though it didn't pay very much. And so my being able to inherit money at the end may make me look even more privileged and make me look a little bit like a mooch. But that's the way it was. Um, Now we finally come to saying, now again, what is a man then? Let me just mention that this whole time I was used to the idea that fully transgender adults don't really pose any significant policy issues. And now, in fact, they can serve in the military if they're stable. If they're fully transitioned, the female privacy issue kind of goes away. And it's rare that sports would be an issue in actual practice. There are just not that many people. However, um, I've always thought, going the other way, if a female transitioned to a man and somehow could play a male sport, maybe become a relief pitcher in baseball or something, that would be just fine. That would be great. Except that biologically, it doesn't sound like that's very likely that it's really going to happen, as we've learned from studying the biology of sex more recently. Um, Now, because biological boys and biological girls face future obligations, they may not always have control. Boys, particularly going into the military, particularly in other countries, are setting examples. When this happens in Ukraine or Israel, or of course, in other countries that have a draft like Finland and Austria, Switzerland, when this kind of thing happens, it indirectly kind of adds to the issue for us, I think. Now, gender now gender nonconforming youth in grade schools and middle school and so forth, and probably in high school, may be put at a social disadvantage, so they're perceived as not being able to carry their weight if something happens, and it is necessary for them to actually deal with this. Just like I had to deal with it, and get better. And in fact, when I was in the military myself, I think I didn't mention before, I was actually in special training company for about 6 weeks. That delayed my getting out of basic. But I actually got so that I could pass the physical with a decent score. And so even I was way below average when I was growing up and still had puberty, I got to where was acceptable in the military as far as my strength and performance as a male. And that's important. I eventually learned to adjust at age 24. So that's an important fact too. Now, I can understand that for youth, for example, changing, socially transitioning, or maybe claiming to be non-binary or some partial measure or something, it may provide them a sense of relief for the time if they feel they don't fit in, or if they feel pressured from their peers in the case of teenage girls and so forth. But of course, medicalization, I won't go into detail here about puberty blockers and so forth, but it may compromise their future well-being. And get to the last slide here. It's some young people believe that they really are, in the sense of the verb, to be the opposite gender, and of course, can't people get canceled for questioning that? The idea of soul seems to have gotten into our public policy. But a belief can be a truth or it can be a lie, and then we talk about resurrection or something, or faith and so forth. Um, but And there may even be brain structure issues that we'll find out more about in the past. But in the past, we've known that people have personality traits that are a little bit odds with their biological sex. Judith Butler talked about it. Paul Rosenfels talked about it. I've talked about him on previous post videos before. That a biological man could be psychologically feminine and still be heterosexual and marry a psychologically masculine female, and they could still have a good marriage. And that happens all the time. And back in the 70s, when his polarity theory was being talked around, it was simply for personal growth. It was not supposed to be a public policy issue. But many people want this idea of soul to be recognized in legal rights and names and salutations. Remember what Mr. and Mrs. means? We used to use those for married or unmarried for women's, and pronouns, even before any kind of physical transition is possible. And authoritarian societies could really take advantage of this. So, I never personally bought into this. I was a man simply because I was a male, and that was it. I didn't have the idea that I had a separate soul identity, so I never accepted that. Um, but the idea, one of the important ideas, was that when I was single all these years, and gay marriage didn't become possible, didn't until early in the 21st century, and wasn't fully legally recognized till 2015. And so I was used to the idea that of simply leveraging my being single and being able to work for less money, but sometimes it was taken advantage of, and people would expect me to be on call at work for people who had families, and that was kind of the way it was. Single people were at a discount, but a lot of times they were easy. It was easier for them to keep jobs for that reason. That's kind of what I was used to in the 90s, and that's a big deal. I talk about that a lot in my first Do As to Tell book. Um, in fact, I've even thought that the word marriage, we could have had it so that we used the word civil union and gave people the same rights, exactly the same couples, exactly the same rights, but don't call it marriage Because we want to remind people the importance of actually having that most people have kids. I think that would have actually been a better idea. So that's got basically what I do have to say about this for right now. And I do thank you for listening.